Congratulations on your graduation from Mini Painting 101 and welcome to Mini Painting 102. Hello friends and welcome to this, my first Miniature Painting 102 video. Now, as you might have guessed, this is a follow-up to the 101 series that we started recently, where I just gave you a very quick overview of all the things that you would want to know to get into miniature painting. The point of this 102 series now is that we're going to start breaking that down, so it's going to get a little bit more detailed from here, but we're going to really start to get into the nitty-gritty of what we want to do and why we want to do it. And at the end of each video, we'll also talk a bit about tools and materials. Okay, so the first thing we're going to want to talk about is getting those miniatures off of those sprues. First of all, we want to be careful that we're not clipping too close to the sprue when we use our side cutters to take the miniature off. We're going to want to leave a couple of millimeters gap and just leave a little burr attached to the miniature itself. This is just to prevent any stress from the clipping process damaging the actual plastic of the miniature, which is something you won't be able to clean off and would have to go back in and fill with some kind of putty or something. It's a pain in the arse and it's easily avoided. That little burr that's left over, dead easy to cut off. You just get yourself a sharp hobby knife and whip it off and then clean it up with the rest of the miniature. Nice and easy. One tip that I will give you is if you're unsure if any of that burr that you've left behind is still showing in the miniature, you can take the flat of your knife and just run it gently across the surface of that miniature and you'll feel it feeding back through your knife. If the bump is still there, you'll feel the blade pass over a bump. So that's a really good way that you can just tell if it's there but maybe you can't see it. Okay, next just a brief chat now about seam lines. There are kind of two reasons why these occur and we need to tackle both of them in a slightly different way. So firstly, the seam lines that occur from the moulding process. Now this is just where the two halves of the mould meet and a little bit of plastic squeezes into the gap between them. It can't be helped, it can't be prevented, but you do have to clean it off if you want nice crispy looking miniatures. So we just use the side of an X-Acto blade to gently scrape away at that and get it removed. Dead easy. The other type of seam line that we need to note is where two components join together. Now this one's a little bit more tricky because we're going to be putting glue into that joint and we need to make sure that that glue is completely dry before we try and scrape. If you try and scrape too early, especially with plastic glue, you'll get this kind of rubbery sort of material removing with it and it looks very rough and it attracts a lot of grit and it tends to lead to a bit of a nasty looking finish. So I would recommend just making sure that that glue's had a good 30 minutes to completely go off before you scrape any glue lines, and you can see that you can still make them disappear really nicely. Right, let's have a conversation about gluing. Gluing is obviously very important. We need to get these miniatures fixed together so that they're looking all nice and presentable and so that they're ready to paint. So with your plastic kits, you're really going to want to be using plastic glue. Sounds like a no-brainer, but super glue is such a common thing that exists that a lot of people do use it for plastic kits as well. There are advantages to using super glue. It's not the most permanent bond, so you can often break it off if you don't want the join that you've got or if you need to change something around or whatever, whereas plastic glue is very much a permanent bond. It physically melts the two areas together. However, that is actually what you're going to want when you're transporting these miniatures around and playing games with them. You're not going to want things breaking off all the time and having to glue them back on all the time. So where possible, I always recommend plastic glue. That said, things like resin kits and metal kits will not glue together with plastic glue, so you are going to need to use super glue for those. I like to use a spray-on activator to help that cure faster and harder, and it gives you a better overall super glue bond. One of the really nice things about plastic glue is because it melts those joins together, it also helps hide those join lines. A little tip for this: if you just sparingly spread plastic glue over the surfaces that you're going to glue and then you squeeze them together really tightly, a little bit too tight initially, and then as they relax, the plastic will expand in that gap that's been melted by the plastic glue, and once you've scraped it away with a knife after it's dried, that's going to really help hide that join line. That said, it is important to glue sparingly. We don't want to put so much in there that loads of excess glue shoots out of the gaps where we've joined two components together. So just be careful to make sure that you're not overloading areas with glue. Just really try to think about the minimum amount that you're going to need to get the job done. Okay, a very brief little prep job now because it's not an essential one, but I want to talk just very shortly about drilling. Drilling out gun barrels adds a really nice finishing touch, and to be honest, on a lot of newer kits, especially from Games Workshop, gun barrels are now already hollow. They have a hole there in the middle. Some of your gun barrels are just going to be finished as a flat piece of plastic, and adding that little hole in there is just a little chef kiss touch that looks really, really nice. The first thing you're going to want to do is take the tip of a sharp hobby knife and you're going to want to make a little center punch. This is going to guide your drill and make sure that it doesn't go wayward and put the hole in the wrong place. You can locate the center by eye. It's a very, very small area, so you don't need to be absolutely perfect on it because it's just not going to notice, but you do want that guideline there. You make this just by placing that tip of the knife onto the plastic and twisting until it starts to form just a little puncture. Once you've got that puncture mapped out where you want it, then you can place the pin vise drill against it, give it a few twists and it will start to bury itself in there, and it's going to send out some little twizzly bits of plastic, but in the end you're going to get a nice clean hole once you've removed all of that, and it's going to look brilliant. Okay, next we're going to have a chat about priming, and priming it's a bit of a difficult one for me to do a beginner friendly video on because I'm lucky enough to own an airbrush setup, and once you own an airbrush setup it becomes very clear very quickly that that just is the quickest, easiest, most efficient way to prime miniatures. However, I do feel the need to just spend a couple of minutes talking to you about some of the don'ts perhaps in the priming process. So if you don't happen to own an airbrush, first of all, what is the smartest way to prime your miniatures? Well, I personally think that using a brush on method is actually the most reliable way. Not only is this going to teach you a lot about the feel for thinning paints down, which is a very useful thing to understand, especially in the early days, but it's going to give you a lot more control. It's going to let you really understand how you're applying paint to the miniature. So for a brush on primer, all you're going to want to do is get a really, really heavy, solid coverage black. Now for this, the ones that I recommend would be Scale 75's Art Black from their Artist range, or Reaper Master Series Dragon Black from their Pathfinder range. Those two are the blacks that I've found to be the most pigment dense. They handle thinning the best. They also both happen to have a really nice matte finish, which means that after they dry, you can still see all of the detail of the miniature really, really nicely. You're going to want to take about 3 parts water to 1 part paint roughly, and I do say roughly because that's not going to be an exact recipe. Different paints are going to want different amounts of thinning, but you can get an idea from the consistency that I'm showing you here. You want something that's quite runny, and you're just going to liberally brush it on, but just be careful not to let it gather in the details of the miniature. It's usually going to take 2 coats of primer to get this ready with a brush, but as you can see, it does a really, really good job. Now, rattle cans are something that I personally recommend that beginners steer clear of, and this is going to be contrary to a lot of advice that you've heard elsewhere. But at the end of the day, when we're looking for beginner friendly ways into the hobby, we want to minimize things that can go wrong. And whilst rattle cans can do a brilliant job and they can be fantastic given the right conditions and the right usage, it's also very easy for rattle cans to mess up your miniatures. They spray at very high pressure, which means that they can fill in detail. If you spray from too far back, they can go spackly. If you spray from too close, they can very, very immediately overload the detail of the miniature. They're also affected to an extent by the environment, the amount of heat, cold or wind that's available. You obviously have to go outside in order to prepare your miniatures. So there are a lot of factors that I think actually make rattle cans very inconvenient. And this is, as I say, contrary to popular teaching. A lot of people will say, oh, rattle cans are the easiest way to get a nice thin flat primer. Hopefully I've demonstrated in the brushing method that that's not the case, and I hope that you will consider whether or not you want to use brush or rattle can. One last final thing that I just want to touch on briefly is the colour that we prime. It's really not as important as it's often made out to be. There is this somewhat strange myth that if you want to paint with mostly bright colours, you have to undercoat white, and if you want to paint with mostly dark colours or metallics, you have to paint black. Now, this may have been true perhaps 15 or 20 years ago when paints were much lower coverage, had a much worse working consistency. However, these days companies like Games Workshop and Vallejo are producing such high coverage, densely pigmented miniature paints that whether you're over a white undercoat or a black undercoat or a grey undercoat indeed, you're going to get to full coverage after about 2 or 3 coats with pretty much any colour. There's going to be a couple of exceptions where you need to maybe use an underpainting of a colour initially, but at the end of the day, it's not enough to affect the overall finished look of the miniature. The only time undercoat colour really matters is if you're applying lots of transparent paints over the top, stuff like acrylic inks or Citadel's contrast paints. In this case, you are going to want to think very, very carefully about what your undercoat looks like. So all of that said, I normally go with a black or sometimes a grey undercoat for my miniatures. And the reason for this is quite simply because that's what allows me best to see the detail. With a white undercoat, I find that my eyes sometimes find it difficult just to focus in on details, and that can be a real pain in the arse when you're new to the hobby and trying to figure out how to place everything on the miniature. I find with a nice matte black or grey undercoat, I've got really, really good visibility. And with a grey undercoat, if you are struggling for visibility, you can also just wash a really thin amount of black paint over that into the recesses. And I do mean a very, very thin amount, but that's going to then give you a really clear kind of black lined map of the miniature. Okay, so with all of that said and done and all of those instructions, I don't want you to feel too overloaded. So I just want to go over the tools that you will need very quickly to do the things that I've described to you in the way that I would do them. So first of all, we're going to want a nice set of flush cutters. These are usually used for electronics, but they exist for various different reasons as well. You can pick them up off Amazon very, very cheap, and to be honest, even a cheap set is going to last you a very, very long time. This pair in particular cost me, I think, £4, and I've had it now for about 3-4 years. So do be careful not to fall into the trap of spending 20 quid on a pair of clippers, because you're going to get that mileage out of them no matter what. The next one is a sharp hobby knife. Now, I like these X-Acto style knives with the removable blades. You just twist at the handle and the blade can then be removed, and then you can place a fresh one back in, twist again, and it will lock into place. The reason I prefer these is because, to be honest with you, replacing these blades that are about 99p for 7 is a lot cheaper than replacing a whole knife. So I always say go for an X-Acto style blade. It's also very tapered and accurate, and it can get into little nooks and crannies and stuff like that. So it's a really useful tool for a lot of different things. Next up, glues, super and plastic. This is plastic glue, this is super glue. These are going to be the two glues that do pretty much all of our hobby gluing. I did say that my recommendation is for plastic glue over super glue, but that said, if you are using super glue, I do also recommend you pick up a nice can of super glue activator, which is going to be a brilliant tool for just getting that super glue cured very quickly, and it also makes the bond a little bit harder. You're also going to want to get yourself a pin vise drill. This is a brilliant tool. Like I said in the section where we talked about it, it's not essential. You do not have to own one of these to hobby, but I do highly recommend them. One of the more advanced things that I didn't talk about in this video is pinning, which is a process essentially where we use metal rods to fix together miniatures that are fragile, or to permanently fix miniatures into their bases, for example. Now, you're not going to get into pinning straight away when you start hobby, and so when you first buy this, all it's going to do is what we talked about earlier, drilling out gun barrels. But already having it on hand when you do want to start to look into pinning, when you're buying huge resin kits that need additional support to hold their components together, for example, you're already going to have the tool on hand. You're going to be very happy that you already own it. Now, these are, again, super cheap from Amazon. I always buy mine from Amazon. I think this is the second one I've ever owned in my life. So once again, 6-7 quid, and it's going to last you a very, very long time. They're a great tool. And finally, a brush that you don't care about too much for brush priming. This is just, it was a size 3 of an old hog brush that I used to use just for honking in heavy details, and it's all gone a bit frayed and a bit rough now. It's not in the best condition anymore, so I've just decided to turn it into a priming brush. You're also going to want that really nice, solid, heavy coverage black paint. This is the Scale 75 Artist Black that I recommended, but I did also say there's a Reaper paint that's brilliant for the same job. These two will form the backbone of your brush priming method. So if you're going to go for that brush priming method and that's what you want to try, then crappy brush, really good coverage black paint. You're never going to regret it. And that about wraps up Prep 102, part of my new Miniature Painting 102 series. If you think there's anything that I missed, or if you've got any comments, observations, or you'd like to chat about anything, of course, do get at me in the comments. Let's discuss it. Love that engagement. If you liked the video, then don't forget to click that like button. And if you want to subscribe to the channel, you can enable notifications, and YouTube will very kindly tell you whenever I upload a new video. I do also have a Patreon, so if you want to support the continued creation of this content as it becomes my full-time job, you can do so by checking the link in the description, where you'll also find links to all of my socials, and I'll toss in a few links to some of the cool tools that we spoke about today. So with all of that said, it's probably time I get myself out of here, folks. Thank you so much for joining me for this one. I hope you found it helpful, informative and useful, and I hope that you'll be back to watch the rest of the 102 series. But until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.